Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and this is the 2024 Job Market series where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research in India. I spoke with Sukrit Puri, who is a PhD candidate in political science at MIT and an Eleanor Ostrom Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research focus is on the entanglement between business and politics in emerging economies, and his dissertation focuses on family firms in India. We discussed his job market paper, Corporate Kinship, Political Attachments of the Family Firm. We talked about how family firms differ from management and expert-run businesses in India, whether it is in their firm structure or their political giving, whether family firms are more strategic or expressive in politics, the differences in the nature of the quid pro quo for a family firm versus a management-run firm, the latest electoral bond scheme, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Sometimes it can feel like a full-time job keeping tabs on the latest development in politics in India. If you're struggling to keep up, let the Grand Tamasha podcast be your guide. Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the world's most respected think tanks, and the Hindustan Times, one of India's leading media houses. Each week, host Milan Vaishnav takes listeners on a deep dive into Indian politics, economics, foreign policy, culture, and society. Over the past 5 years, Grand Tamasha has published more than 200 conversations on the issues that matter most to Indians and those who watch India from abroad, featuring guests ranging from the comedian Hasan Minhaj to the historian Ramachandra Guha and the philanthropist Rohini Nilekani. Grand Tamasha is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Subscribe now to get your weekly infusion of timely and provocative India content straight to your personal device. New episodes are released every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Visit www.grandtamasha.com to browse past episodes and to learn more about the show. Hi Sukrit, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here, and it's so nice to meet you again. You're a Mercatus Fellow and you've been in and out of our office, but it's very cool to do this and to see you on the job market.
Thank you so much, Shruti. I've been a regular listener to your show for my entire doctoral program, and it's been a large inspiration for my work as well. So it's
then
really
I must apologize in advance.
No.
So in your job market, I mean, you're looking really at like sort of political connections and the entanglement between politics and business, which is something that's very exciting for me given my intellectual and personal background. And your job market's really fascinating because it starts looking not just at firms, but family-run firms in India, which is not just a uniquely Indian thing, but in India we have a lot of them. And what you show is that even though India has this multi-party system, both at the union level and the state levels, firms with greater family involvement, especially at the board and the leadership level, overwhelmingly tend to remain loyal to a particular political party, as opposed to, what you would normally expect, which is they sort of donate to everyone and they hedge their bets if it's a close contest, or they switch their loyalties as the economy is changing or as the local politics is changing. And what you also find is that these family firms, which is very counterintuitive, they're more likely to donate to what you call lost causes, like politically lost causes. That is, parties that are not holding state level or national level office at the moment, and the quid pro quo is not very obvious on what these parties that are not in power can do for the firm. And you do this by looking at campaign contributions from 2003 to 2021. So, it's like the post-liberalization, non-license permit Raj kind of world. And the quid pro quo that you specifically study are in the form of government contracts or public sector loans on favorable terms, both of which are, sort of well established in the literature. And your main explanation is that for these family firms, the political participation is not so much about economic and political opportunism, it is much more driven by long-term relationships, caste networks, kinship networks, and so on. Is this a good way to think about what you're doing in your paper?
No, thank you so much. That was an excellent summary. A driving motivation, I guess, for any study of, I guess, business and politics is just recognizing, that commentators, journalists, academics world over are sort of ringing the alarm bells about corporate influence over democratic politics. Who are these unelected folks that are sort of coming in, distorting the democratic field, distorting accountability in politics, things like that. But the way studies have sort of gone about this, so I guess like the way people have looked at this is by, have really treated corporations as almost like a homogenous profit maximizing entity. And I think like, you and I know that, corporations are nothing but an amalgamation of individuals that come together, under certain, institutional conditions or whatever. And sort of like, there's actually tons of variation in types of companies. Not all companies are the same. And I wanted to take that more seriously and understand, what are the different types of companies? Companies can be different in, the people that are involved in running it, in their goals and aspirations, in, how they operate. And I wanted to see, how different types of companies might, participate in the political arena more differently. India is one of those countries where people have been, ringing the alarm bells of corporate influence. So Billionaire Raj by James Crabtree is a fantastic account of like crony capitalism in the post-liberalization period. And, one thing when you're studying businesses in India is you can't really escape the fact that these businesses, they all tend to be rather, family-run affairs. And so I wanted to just take that more seriously because the idea is, family businesses are not always, certainly the literature on family businesses has recognized that they are not always a permanently purely strategic profit maximizing actor. The family business literature recognizes that family businesses have a series of non-economic incentives that might change and, change the choices that they make. And so my question was, well, what about, the political choices that a family business might make? How might that look different? And so India is my setting.
Cutting into this, the way you phrase it in the paper is family businesses depart from a purely profit maximizing enterprise. I guess, this may be a quibble over words, but as an economist, I would say they are still profit maximizing given constraints. It's just that constraints are slightly different because their board members are also going to sit not just in the boardroom, but in the dining room and in the wedding hall and, so on and so forth. So I think, I would still, when I model them, I would still think of them as profit maximizing as a firm, but their constraints are, of course, different. But the second part that you add to that is super interesting, that they don't give political contributions the way we expect a firm to give. They tend to reflect the views of a patriarch in a family, right? And so it's almost a little bit more like individual campaign contribution giving, which is it tends to be more expressive than so explicitly profit maximizing. Is that a good way is that a good way to nuance that distinction? And also, do we have evidence of family firms behaving this way outside of political settings where the passion or the preferences of the patriarch or, the elder members of the family are very visible, even in how they conduct their business or which markets they want to approach or who they merge with or, so on and so forth?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head with thinking about the distinction between the corporation and the individual. And so, just to take a step back, the way scholars have looked at corporate, at campaign contributions and sort of money in politics, campaign finance, you sort of think about the distinction between why an individual might participate, in making donations to political campaigns, politicians, versus why a company might make a donation. And the idea is that, if you and I were to make a donation to a political party, why we are donating is probably not a sort of a quid pro quo material consideration. You and I, we might like a political party, we might like a particular ideology, something like that. Maybe we're trying to boast to our friends that, I got invited to this fundraiser or something like that. On the other hand, companies, I think the expectation is that companies tend to be more opportunistic, is what I'm calling it. But, you could call it strategic, you could call it pragmatic, different sort of synonyms to describe this behavior where they're really thinking about who can give me, the greatest return on my investment. So you want to think about political donations as an investment for companies and more like a consumption good for individuals.
Yeah.
And the question that I'm sort of coming to with the family firm is, well, what happens when you really can't distinguish between the corporate form and the individuals that are behind the company? As you said, the way you want to think about a family firm is you want to think about concentrating a lot of discretion and agency in the hands of a few individuals, typically the patriarch. And what happens then? Should you think about this company, which is a registered entity? It operates legally like a company, but it acts in many ways like an individual, or it could. And so the question is, like, what happens in this case?
Or a family speaking in one voice at the very least, if not an individual.
Yes, there's plenty of examples of family dissonance, but I think on average, a family business will sort of come together as a family unit. And so that's sort of to speak to the distinction between, families, firms in general versus individuals. And the family firm sort of sits awkwardly in between these two categories. There are plenty of examples. Family businesses is not a new field of study, especially in management and corporate finance. In political science, less so. There's in fact very little said about how family businesses participate in the political arena. But there's actually quite a lot that has been said about how family businesses operate in, the sort of core strategic decisions that a company might make. And so, simple things like, why should you, pass on the reins of your business to your son? Typically son, could be daughter, but invariably it's a son. Why is that? Managerial genes do not really pass on from one generation to the next. And, so there's like folk wisdom that, it like takes 3 generations and the family firm whittles away, things like that. That choice is not necessarily a profit maximizing or an optimal strategy in that sense. In fact, some really great work in management. There's this World Management Survey. So Nick Bloom, John Van Reenen, Rafaela Sadun, and a whole large set of co-authors, they've really they've taken management very seriously. And what they find is that family businesses tend to sort of systematically make suboptimal management decisions in deciding to enter new businesses, in delegating to employees, things like that. So economists have studied this quite extensively, and they've looked at, how family businesses in developing countries tend to really not grow as fast. And one of the reasons for that is there's a trust deficit between, you want to sort of keep operational decision making in the hands of the trusted few. Precisely. In your sort of dogged focus to keep control, you might actually not be willing to trust and delegate to professional managers, to hired employees. And this creates a wedge in performance. So even in the case of in India, so Manaswini Bhalla at IIM Bangalore has done some fantastic work on this. So she has a bunch of co-authors and a bunch of different projects. And, specifically, you can see sort of the behavior of these patriarchal firms, that they're more likely to merge with one another. And you sort of see worse performance for shareholders, lack of diversity in the corporate boardroom, produces like worse financial outcomes for firms. And so really it echoes very classic work by Gary Becker on, the economics of discrimination. Like, what happens when you decide to discriminate? Well, you might be leaving money on the table. You might sort of be missing out on opportunities, things like that. And so that's the broader literature that I'm sort of trying to join.
Yeah, and I think another thread through this is greater level of risk aversion and maybe too much skin in the game is another way of putting it. Managers and experts brought in from outside are going to have contracts and golden parachutes and so on, and have less skin in the game. As we know now, they are more short-termist in their thinking, and they'll get hired by someone else. Whereas in a family firm, especially when all earning members of the family are employed in the same thing, you may be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more risk averse, because it's not going to be one person losing their livelihood. It's probably most of your family's wealth and intergenerational wealth, which may tank with a couple of bad decisions. Another thing I find fascinating about families, and I grew up in New Delhi, as you did in part, you have weddings, which are like mergers, right? Between like 2 business families, and they'll announce a joint venture, which is, I'm not talking about the baby, I'm talking literally about a joint venture coming out of the wedding. So it's a little bit, it's funky what goes on in some of these, smaller Indian family health firms.
No, absolutely. And you're completely correct to point out that, it's not to say that, family businesses are just sort of a suboptimal economic outcome. Like in many ways, Tarun Khanna has especially written about this stuff, which is in some some ways it is actually the optimal decision, and family businesses we know tend to last longer because of that sort of longer time horizon, the more risk aversion. And so, it really depends on like what you want, but certainly you should think about them as sort of distinct in their orientation and their objectives. And so once you sort of recognize that they have differences in orientation and objective, how does that then produce different predictions for a political game is what I'm trying to study.
What you find is that they tend to give to a single party. They tend to have these connections that are a little bit more long-term. A lot of it is based on ethnicity of the person leading the party or most of the cadre of the party and the family's ethnicity, caste, and so on. But I'm wondering if there's a slightly different way of interpreting the same results, right? So one possibility I see is this, especially coming from your section on political lost causes. Is this a way of old school CSR philanthropy, right? Which is there's a tax break that comes with donating to a political party. We're talking about, publicly made, disclosed donations for most part in this paper. And it's tax exempt. So maybe this is not so much a lost cause or like kinship. It's just you're going to give some money away philanthropically. You might as well mix philanthropy with some future political connections and potential. And that's how you give it away. And if my hunch is right, then you should see a clean break in 2014-15 when the union government mandated 2% has to be given away in CSR money with a criminal penalty and jail time, if I'm right about that change in rule. So do you think something like that is going on there? Did you at all try to look at CSR? Because you do mention the CSR literature also in your paper, but I don't see this clear test, but I imagine that could be done in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea. I think you are very right to bring up and invoke the CSR literature, because when I talk to these businesses and I ask them, why did you make a donation? Of course, everything's off the record, but I would say that the way it is described echoes a lot of how they talk about corporate social responsibility. It is not this sort of like, what can I get from this person? But it is a lot more like, as an upstanding citizen and as a believer of like democracy or whatever. And sure, I may have some like preferences and, sort of I have social ties with some person. So it is, one second or third generation business owner once told me that, the least controversial CSR decision that a company can make is to just give to the local temple. And that's a very interesting, very profound point, because that is the channel through which you sort of embed these family businesses in a broader community network. Yeah. And very similarly, another very common response to the question of why did you donate was something very much like, my daughter's father-in-law gave me a call and, I wanted to look good in front of him. I mean, that second part wasn't said, but it's obvious that's probably obvious. The reason, and there's nothing surprising here. It is just that, yes, I mean, these are individual motivations that are coming forth, and, there's a tax break associated with making the donation. So you sort of do that.
Same as giving away philanthropically. What I mean is the tax break is not different.
Exactly. And in fact, so there's some very interesting stuff. In fact, I'm starting to work with these folks, Aline Gatignon at Wharton and Christiana Baudet at Imperial. So they're management scholars, and they've actually looked at the CSR spending of companies in India, and it actually looks very similar. You sort of see these like very large companies are sort of making these strategic bets across multiple different buckets of CSR spending, whereas a lot of companies are actually sort of just they're choosing one thing, maybe it's education or something like that, and they're sort of like they're acting more as if, like you and I, when we make our sort of like charitable donations, we might give to like a local school or something like this.
Yeah, but my sense is it can tease out that difference between the strategic family firm decision versus the expressive, political decision on the part of the patriarch. Because if this is true, you should at least see the lost causes part disappear after 2014, or at least reduce, right? And the rest of it remains. So I think you might be able to tease out the difference even more sharply in the original setup of your research design, and also illuminate, a little bit more about your findings.
That's a really good point, and I will take note and report back to you how companies, I guess, like think about it from a more of a portfolio perspective, like CSR spending versus political spending, and if there is a sort of like a hedging or sort of a switching strategy or something like that. I think that sounds pretty fascinating and very doable as well.
Yeah, the second question I'm going to ask you now, this is a little bit harder, right? A short period of the 20 odd years that you look at, there's a short period of about 4 years, which is electoral bonds. And, let's leave that aside. Is it possible that they give the disclosed amounts to their caste and kin networks, but actually they do have a portfolio and hedging approach, but they just give in cash to the parties that don't belong to their caste networks, because at the end of the day, they have to show their face at the local temple or the local mosque and at the weddings, and they have to attend PTA at their children's schools. So this becomes really important, and anyone can look at the disclosed amounts. So that you're going to give only to people that is less controversial, right? And save face in the community. Is that a possibility? I especially ask this because before electoral bonds were now, so much of the political donations was just done in cash because it's anonymous, right? That was the protection.
You are 100% correct. This is in some ways it is the tip of the iceberg. But in some ways, it's actually just a different iceberg, actually. You actually want to think about these as different categories of political activities of firms. The disclosed nature of these donations do very much, I would guess, play a role in how companies are thinking about it. And in fact, so I'm going to even, further make your point, which is to say you can actually now see, because of the Supreme Court ruling, you can actually see the behavior of companies in the electoral bonds, the sort of more covert space.
Yeah.
And they do look different. So there's a lot more multi-party giving, there's a lot more higher frequency and like greater amounts. So like electoral bonds is probably the arena of strategic politics where disclosed donations
or
are
used
probably
to be before they mandated the disclosure.
Certainly. Which sort of acted retroactively. So there was
Exactly. Yeah, but I don't think we'll see that in the future.
Yeah, that's right. So you can kind of, it's very nice. You can see that this disclosed channel sort of tends to look a lot more expressive, whereas the undisclosed, what happens under the cover of darkness, tends to look a lot more strategic. That said, I'm going to go even further and say, there's very interesting work that has been done on the role of local politicians or like regional, even like MPs and MLAs. And you want to think about them less as sort of legislative agents and more as sort of local fixers.
Yeah, brokers,
and this is
exactly. They're power brokers locally.
Exactly. So, I think like Alexander Lee at Rochester has some really interesting stuff which like makes this point. And when you're thinking about, these are donations so what we can observe is we can observe companies making donations to political parties. You really need to have a channel through which, how does a donation to a political party actually get me, the tax man to get off my back or something like this? It's a few steps away. And so what is much simpler probably is by just sort of bribing the taxman right away, or someone, or maybe that MP or MLA. That's not going to be visible in this very formalized, expressive donation channel. And so a response to this might be like, okay, so why did you waste your time studying this useless channel? And I think
that's not my response to this, actually.
Okay,
but go ahead.
I think it's a reasonable response. At minimum, I would say, well, one, like it's actually a fairly large amount, so I think it is worth looking at.
Yeah.
But also, studies on campaign finance have basically studied campaign contributions because it's the most visible form of politics. Yeah. And so if the conclusion is, hey, this is not where the action's happening, that is actually a very profound and deep point to the literature, certainly, that, hey, this is actually not where the action's happening. I think all in all, it justifies why you want to study this. And I think it actually makes a pretty deep point that maybe, quid pro quo politics is happening in other arenas.
Yeah, but I'm a little bit more concerned over what it does for your results in this particular paper. Not that you shouldn't study formal campaign finance. It's more that the point where you land by studying well-established, disclosed data on campaign contributions is it's less opportunistic, more driven by kin networks, caste networks, long-term relationships. But what if, when you see the rest of the iceberg, it's like, oh, these guys are doing the same thing that regular firms do. They're hedging their bets. It's just because they're a family and they are in a particular community and they can't just up and leave and go to another Fortune 500 company in another city tomorrow if things go south. They need to be embedded in the local politics of it, and therefore they will give a lot of their giving. So they have the same portfolio approach as any management-run firm. You just don't see all of it because they need to get their daughters married and they need to be, able to attend, family events and things like that. So that's where I'm going with this. Does it undermine in any way how sharp the difference is between management-run firms and family-run firms? Because this part we don't see. But if it's established that they will give, will they hedge? Will they have a diversified portfolio?
Yeah. It's certainly possible. The results, I think, in that case make the point that family businesses are probably they are constrained by more factors, perhaps.
Yes.
And so you are learning something about the reputation and sort of like social embeddedness and how that sort of leaves an imprint on how companies actually need to operate. And so, even at minimum, if you just sort of point out that, look, like actually the sort of the political hedging is simply happening in like, under the table channels, it tells you, what are the set of things that a company is willing to sort of disclose and share publicly. And I think that itself is actually quite informative because we don't really think about companies as needing to sort of we do have a sense that companies like to manage their reputation, but we actually don't know too much about how ethnic identity becomes one of those dimensions through which companies are looking to manage their reputation. It's usually something about being a good steward or something like that.
And I think it's not just ethnic identity. I think I read this in your paper, but I might have read somewhere else on how Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. But that's like a religious, ethnic dimension. But I see, especially if you live on Twitter the way folks like me live on Twitter, you see, there's a very serious, red team, blue team kind of division, people just coming out, like, venture capitalists coming out and saying, we endorse so-and-so for these reasons, and it's got to do with our tech manifesto or AI safety or something like that. So I think we don't just care to hedge our bets, but we also care about expressive voting and a very sharp agenda politically, not just driven by the firm. I think we're going to see this beyond family firms and also beyond like very simple caste lines. So overall, I think what you're doing is hugely informative and very helpful. But it's helpful to tease all of this out in the Indian context, if you know what I mean.
No, absolutely. And I think, as any good academic, you're supposed to think about what is your contribution. And some scholars have actually looked at, the role of ideology and partisanship in U.S., corporate politics, which is exactly what you're talking about. So if you go back, a couple of decades, there's the lobbyist for Disney once said, Mickey Mouse is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. But in today's era, Mickey Mouse might need to be either a Republican or a Democrat. Very few
famously,
companies.
Michael Jordan refused to endorse the candidates in his home state. Right, it caused this huge political row, and that was along race lines. Not red team, blue team, but that was another big one.
Yeah, and yet last night Taylor Swift came out in support of Kamala. So Kamala Harris. So there's certainly ideology is playing this role in America, and the question is like, what is that cognate in another context? And I think in India, what is the sort of the deep cleavages that define politics in India is actually just the durable cleavages often tend to be along ethnic identity lines, and you're kind of seeing this play out at the corporate level, which I think is one of
and it's fun to look at it from the point of view of family firms because we also have so much marriage endogamy, right? So
Certainly.
The interaction between that caste, religion, language, a sort of concentration in expressive preferences with marriage endogamy and how that plays out in the boardroom becomes super, super useful device. I have a couple of questions now on the other side, which is the quid pro quo side, right? So we're talking about these firms give this money away. Presumably they're getting something, or they're doing this purely for expressive reasons and not getting something. And the quid pro quo that you look at is government contracts, which are given, both at the union level, state level, in some advanced states at the local level, and so on. And the second kind of quid pro quo is favorable loans on favorable terms from public sector banks, right? And both of these quid pro quo aspects are very well established in the economics corruption literature. My question here is this a good measure, or is this again just the tip of the iceberg? Because, with public sector loans especially, you need union government blessing for that, right? That's much more concentrated in the hands of a few bureaucrats and politicians. Government contracts much more at the union, state and local level. So that's one part of it. So are we misunderstanding something because the government public sector bank didn't give a favorable loan? Maybe that wasn't the point of the donation in the first place, but that doesn't mean it's a lost cause or purely expressive, And the second aspect of that you partially touched on, which is the fixer nature, because, the quid pro quo, in Indian political economy, business is so much entangled with sort of like, this license permit Raj. So even though it was formally removed for industrial licensing, you have labor inspectors, right? You have this like enormous machinery of tax inspectors and tax auditors and, so on. Now you have environmental permissions and clearances. Sometimes those work at the Gram Panchayat level. So is that the quid pro quo that's taking place? And that's also why it seems more local and more kin-based?
Firstly, I think you've hit on the issues very, very, very nicely. I think it is a moving target to figure out what is a quid pro quo. I think the way people approach the question of corporate politics is by sort of searching for quid pro quo. You kind of assume it, and you're sort of like looking for evidence in many ways. Now, it's actually more challenging than it is. So certainly, in the American context, it's actually very ambiguous what the returns are to corporate political donations. In other countries, some papers will find more, smoking gun evidence, but it is really a challenge to figure out what it is that companies are actually after. Because you're right, there are so many other things that they might be after, and what you're restricted to is what are the set of things that you can actually get good measurements on. And so that's the nature of, I guess, like empirical research. And so I was able to I was able to sort of get loans from state-owned banks, and I was able to get government procurement contracts and sort of try to stitch those things together. And I didn't find too much evidence for it. But yes, there's a whole additional set of things like regulatory forbearance. Maybe some kind of like very like micro level get the tax man off my back kind of things that like it's very impossible to. I mean, maybe there might be some like clever ways to do this using like scraping newspaper data or something like that. But that's also got its own pitfalls.
Yeah. And you won't find the dog that didn't bark, right? Like that's the bigger problem. Because if you look at the electoral bonds evidence, what it shows is they make criminal prosecutions go away. So you're like, with Future Gaming, Mega Engineering, like these are the biggest donors, and it's basically a quid pro quo for not prosecuting. So you're not going to find evidence of a prosecution that, you know what I mean? Like there's something else going on there altogether, which is much, much harder to get in official or unofficial data. I don't think this is a matter of scraping. I think it's just a matter of this is a very complicated political economy.
Yeah, it's sort of like fundamentally some things are unmeasurable, and then some things are sort of like hard to measure. And, I'll also admit that, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So you don't want to sort of like, hang my hat on this particular result. But I would actually add, I think the way I want to sort of make my case that this is actually not about quid pro quo politics is by looking at, so the way scholars have tried to make the case that companies tend to participate strategically is in one of two ways. So one, you can either look at sort of the intent. So you can say like, okay, if you see more of this sort of strategic behavior, ex ante, either like, switching when the incumbent switches, or, hedging, across parties around election times because of uncertainty. All of this is sort of like ex ante strategic behavior. You don't actually see returns for that. And then, so that's one way. That's sort of strategic in intent. And then there's another way, which is like strategic in outcome, which is you look at whether the donations actually resulted in access to loans, access to like profits or, contracts or something like that. And my argument is to say, well, in the first part, we actually don't find evidence of, ex ante strategic intent. We also don't find ex post, or at least I don't find ex post evidence for strategic outcomes. And I'm going to add a third point, which is to say that companies that have greater family involvement on the corporate boards, which, we're calling at the extreme a family business, they tend to make donations with just much smaller check sizes. And so it really makes the point that these are probably token donations, and they are not really, or if you really believe that there are massive returns, we're sort of into this, Talakian puzzle, which is, why so little money in politics? Like, how effective is the money from these, family firms? How effective, and what is the great, political multiplier that these guys have, that they're able to give, like 1 crore or like, 10 lakh donation, and then suddenly manage to get like, multifold returns as well. So that's, I guess, like...
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, actually. I completely agree with you. But I still think to then make the leap and say this is not strategic or opportunistic, but something else altogether, that's something, you need evidence of that something else altogether. And I'm really hoping that the CSR, the substitution or something will come through to make that case a little bit stronger. I mean, I honestly think there's going to be no smoking gun. On this, you're absolutely right. I think it's just a question of triangulation, right? What is the case where we can triangulate the best and give the strongest evidence and, so on and so forth. So do the number of, do temple donations increase in that area and things like that would be interesting. Another question I had for studying the money in politics question is, do you see a sharp break in 2016 with demonetization? Because that's within your time period. Because their money disappears. But if I remember my demonetization nightmare correctly, there was no limit on how much a political party could deposit in a bank, though there were limits for individuals and businesses.
Yeah, I actually don't see too much of a sharp 2016 effect in my disclosed data, and I was I was expecting to see a sharper deviation, because the story in my head was, well, if a company has been really wrongly served by, these are SME businesses in India, like they have great exposure to the informal sector that was decimated by the demonetization shock, and so surely they would wrench their money away and I guess like support the opposition or something like that. And you don't really see that. You don't really see a movement away, to supporting the opposition at all.
If you have the time, I would love to talk about your other paper, which I'm obsessed with. First of all, I must congratulate you on how quickly you got this done. Like, you're looking at how the Supreme Court mandating disclosures on anonymous political donations through electoral bonds impacted publicly listed companies, except this disclosure came a few months ago in March. And we're talking in like early September, and you've had this paper done for a while. So first of all, congratulations on being maybe the most productive person working in this area. So, this is a case where for 6 years, the electoral bonds were a complete black box and anonymized. The only party who knew who gave and to whom is the government, because they are owners of the State Bank of India. But the public and the media and no one else knew who was giving to whom. Right? And what you find is that the Supreme Court judgment saying you have to have transparency and give details of which contributor gave how much money and to which party was a huge surprise. No one really saw that coming, given the state of our judiciary. And what you look at is how it impacted publicly listed companies, especially in the immediate aftermath. And you find that the entire system experienced a sort of, what one would call an information shock, right? Something like information we didn't expect to happen. This was not exactly a leak, but a mandatory disclosure which came ex post. And you find that as a result of this information shock, they underperform by 1.5% of their sort of like all these publicly listed companies that gave cumulatively. It's about 88 companies. And the loss is pretty big. It's about 9 billion in market capitalization, which, just for a point of reference, is over 5 times the amount raised in total by the political parties and over 400 times the total amount contributed by these 88 companies. So the information shock actually has a huge impact for publicly traded companies, which one presumably doesn't see in privately traded companies. Did I get this roughly right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
So what is the underlying mechanism at work here? Because this is a very unique case of a one-time mandated disclosure. We're not going to see this again. So from what I understand, your story or explanation for this is that this is just information shock, which has made a dent in the reputation. So there's this drop in sort of like the traded value, abnormal drop for about a week, and then the effect goes away. So what is the mechanism at work here?
Yeah, no. So it's a very strange shock, right? Because the Supreme Court mandating retroactive disclosure of political activity.
Welcome to the Indian judiciary, Sukrit.
Yeah, I know you've been talking about it for a while, and it never ceases to surprise you, and I guess it never ceases to surprise market participants either. It is, I would say, that the puzzle, in a sense, that frames this piece is, we know that companies benefit from political connections. This is something that, both colloquially, but also like in scholarly literature, we just see like companies that have political connections tend to perform better. But on the other hand, we also kind of know that companies like to hide their political connections. And this is a little bit strange, so there's some work on like, how companies might want to sort of go through shell entities or sort of like put their donations through these like, 501c3s in the American context. Or, I mean, even for years, we knew about the electoral bonds as an anonymous channel, and we knew that companies were participating, but it always raised the question, if companies benefit from political connections, why hide them? You're actually leaving money on the table. So there's got to be something there that explains why a company is not interested in disclosing their political activity and is interested. There's got to be some value in hiding your political activities.
So a question there, is that just because they are not the only people who are involved in the decision to disclose or not disclose? So the way you've set it up is it's the choice of the company, but what if it's the choice of the receiving party? Which is the political party does not wish to disclose this, and companies disclosing this is going to create a bit of a mess on both ends, because then it's going to seem quite obviously corrupt, and the people they're hiding it from is not necessarily investors or even consumers. The people they're hiding it from is voters that companies don't presumably care about, but the parties care about.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's like the institutional rules of the game, that these companies are sort of taking the fact that you have this channel, and in some ways it's a very simple channel to make a donation to a political party, and if it happens to be fully anonymous because the party wants it to be political parties want it to be fully anonymous, then there's nothing you can do about it. You can't really blame the companies. I would say there was always the choice that was available because the disclosed channel already existed, and the way to actually cut a check to give to a political party through the disclosed channel was never any harder than it was to go to the State Bank of India and deposit a check there either. So it was never really, more or less cumbersome. It really is a choice about whether you want this to be disclosed or not.
No, but isn't the accepting party have a say in how they want the money? Like when you go to a store, they're like, are you going to pay by cash or credit card, right? So it's not just my decision, it's also their decision how they wish to be paid, right?
That's true. I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, I guess there are some companies that actually do make both disclosed and undisclosed donations, and some companies that only make undisclosed donations. And so it's a little bit hard to disentangle, I guess, like who is making the choice in this sense. So I'll agree with you there. I think the value of the setting is that you could kind of see what the market response is.
Yes.
To
absolutely. I don't disagree with any of the other stuff. It's just, to me, it doesn't seem like that much of a puzzle that companies want to hide this, because clearly there's something larger at work going on politically that does want to hide the fact that there are such large sums of money involved in politics.
Yeah, the puzzle is a funny one because it's sort of like very obvious to like a lay person, but the literature, I guess, like produces a puzzle because you know that companies benefit from connections and you know that companies want to hide connections, but it does leave like, well, why? Like you should just, you're leaving money on the table by not revealing your connections. And so clearly there has to be a wedge there. There's got to be something that is that benefits companies by having this sort of undisclosed anonymous channel. And that's where these sort of there have been a couple of studies which look at, these surprise leaks and things like that. But there are very few of those kinds of studies.
And they're not across the board. It's a leak for a few companies. It's like the Panama leaks or something like that, right? It's very specific companies who happen to be in that jurisdiction or who happen to have those bank accounts. This is a systemic disclosure across all political parties and all electoral bonds in India.
Yeah, and it is the channel through which campaign finance takes place. It's not, this was like a few companies giving through like a think tank or something like this. This is the primary channel of campaign finance, and you sort of retroactively revealed who made donations when you promised anonymity. So yeah, it's an incredible moment of a government sort of going back on its word, and it's you don't get too many of those. So if you can,
we
you
have
should run a
retroactive
difference.
taxation. They recently went back on property indexation. We do this all the time, Sukrit. Just not at this scale, and just not for important politically connected people.
That's true. But so India is a very fruitful opportunity for people running difference and difference analyses.
Yeah. So couple of follow-up questions. So one, the paper is like super fascinating. You land at the conclusion that because there is no lasting impact, this is sort of, reputational cost and it goes away. But the reputational costs have got to go on longer, right? And this is again why I go back to the earlier question I had about the model, right? Who are they signaling to? So the reputational cost with the investors, you're right, that can go away pretty quickly. The investors assimilate that information on whether to trade that stock or not. But if the informational value is broader to the community, right? Like Tatas are a trusted name, but we will no longer buy their stock kind of thing. Or like, to big mutual funds who will choose not to hold something in a particular kind of portfolio. Those reputational costs have got to last longer, right? Which makes me wonder if this is just a reputational shock question or if there's something else going on there. So, as an economist, there are two ways of thinking about it. One is it's pretty straightforward. This is like very efficient market hypothesis sort of way, right? All the information, the market always assimilates all the information and at that point incorporated it. There was a little bit of an adjustment, let's say 7 days, and they incorporated that information and we're done. But another way of looking at it is that there's something else that is going on, which is it was never really about reputation, but about something else altogether. And there was a waiting period before which the investors could understand, hey, is the sand shifting beneath our feet? Oh, it's not. Okay, let's continue with this investment.
Right. I think maybe it's a question of just sort of labeling it. I think what you've described is right, because when I talk to investors and sort of market participants and I ask them like, hey, how big of a deal was the electoral bond story? Because the journalistic accounts was actually, it's quite big, and certainly, like we were all, rapt attention, like seeing, all sort of news updates about that. But the investor community, it seems like
they knew.
It seems like they, well, yeah, I guess. So one view is that they knew. Another view is that they kind of shrugged it off because, again, like we kind of come back to a very funny, this is Gordon Tullock again, which is why so little money in politics? The actual amounts raised are not that much. So, for instance, the amount raised, or I guess like the New York Times reported about, it's like $1.7 billion sort of was revealed through these electoral bonds, which is a big number, certainly. But every year, the past elections this year, $14 billion is the sort of number that, how costly was the election in India 2024? $14 billion. If that's the case, then like actually $1.7 billion raised through electoral bonds doesn't seem that much. Now, of course, there's like accounting questions and all this, and I'm not trying to like minimize the fact that this is a very important and critical channel. But for a company's balance sheet, the actual amounts that they sort of made donations, it's actually not that material. And I think for publicly listed companies, the investor community ultimately sort of shrugged it off in the long run because it didn't seem to be that material.
But if that's true, it shouldn't even last 7 days, right?
So
it takes a day to check the balance sheet, and most investors presumably already know. And these markets move really fast.
That's true. It is I don't have, again, like great evidence for this, but it seems like trading volumes went up as well, which would suggest that retail traders are probably the ones responsible. So we know something that, like, India has had this like great Robin Hoodification of, equity markets in India over the last, like, call it 5 years. And so you see a lot of retail trading activity.
So basically they're being talked through, all day long. There's this constant chatter in the media, in the newspapers, on TV news for TRP reasons. So they are constantly trading and updating themselves, whereas the institutional investors, you barely see a blip, basically. That would be the hunch. Okay.
Precisely. And so, we know that retail traders are more sensitive to news coverage. And in my paper, I sort of do a little bit of like, a news coverage analysis. And you can kind of see that the way the coverage is happening, it's sort of it's a scandal effect. And so if you're someone who is watching the news and trading your portfolio, you might, think that, okay, these companies are bad companies. And then the institutional investors are sitting there being like, oh, great, I can buy this at the cheap. And so it just takes a week to like sort itself out. So it is a reputational story, but in the sense that like it's a short-term scandal. So
two
maybe
follow-up questions on the scandal nature. Is there a difference between publicly traded companies or conglomerates that also have a stake in media houses and newspapers versus those that don't? So that would be question one. And the follow-up question is, do the people who've been outed increase their advertising in said newspapers and TV news shows? Because then that would be softening the effect. Like, that's the quid pro quo. We're going to advertise or not advertise. And that's the stick and carrot through which you can improve the reputational consequences and not have that much coverage in the media and so on.
That's a really good question. I will, on the first one, I know one thing is the Adani Group's purchase of NDTV, I guess, immediately comes to mind. But one thing to note is the Adani Group was not one of the companies that was revealed, even though I guess the day before the revelation was supposed to happen, people sort of, I guess, like the Adani stock price fell 7% in anticipation. But it turned out they were actually not on the list at all. But no, I think,
at least nothing they are publicly associated with. They have so many shell companies that we at this point just can't keep track of it.
Yeah. This is junior varsity play.
Yeah.
This is not for the big guns.
So I'll tell you what my hunch is, and I wonder if there's a way that you can test for it. So my sense is the reason it goes on for a week and then stops is because of judicial uncertainty. Right? So if you look at the scandal nature that the scandals that happen in the UPA government, the Supreme Court response was to cancel a bunch of government commitments and contracts, right? So the licenses for 2G and all of those things got cancelled. The coal licenses got cancelled, right? And that's going to have a huge impact. So my sense is the market was waiting to see if the Supreme Court says, now that we know this stuff exists and we've opened the can of worms, now we're going to litigate each worm. And if you remember, both sides representing different political parties, they were pleading with the court, do not do this on a case-by-case basis. You can find this in the transcripts, right? So my hunch is that the result or the short-term effect is driven by judicial uncertainty. And I don't think there's a way to prove it here other than maybe allude to transcripts and things like that, but maybe look at some earlier cases of 2G, 3G scams and things like that and see how long that effect persists. Because, when this stuff gets outed, anytime there's a retroactive effect, it lasts quite long. In the case of Vodafone retroactive taxation, it's lasted a decade, when it comes to private investment rates. So I am genuinely surprised it only lasted a week, which means it's a combination of people already knew this information and something else that we are missing. And so one plausible story is it's the media theory that, there's like this overload of media, and when the news cycle changes and these guys move on to something else, everyone moves on.
No, I think that's great. And Shruti, you've given me 2 or 3 great future research papers to work on. So, the persistence of political scandal is actually I think there's an open question, because there are some interesting papers that looked at Volkswagen scandal and things like that. So really fascinating papers. But those are the duration of those reputation costs is much longer.
Yeah.
And you're right. What explains a short-term thing versus a longer-term thing? I think it's actually
and
an open
the interesting
question.
thing is it's short-term across the board for 88 companies. I mean, I know you're looking at the cumulative effects and things like that. So you find a difference between your original method and then you do a synthetic control, right? And the direction is the same, but the magnitude is quite different. What do you think is going on there? Is it just standard, for stock market prices, past prices are not good predictors of future prices? There is no way you can track this intelligently, especially in the face of everything that's changing? Or there's something fundamentally different being measured in these two methods that I could not figure out?
Frankly, it's just sort of different approaches to asking the same question, and I guess each approach sort of makes different assumptions and goes through different the operations of conducting that analysis is different. I can talk more about some of the differences that might be explaining this and might be helpful for listeners as well who are thinking about this. But it's very typical, to do a difference in difference and then think about a synthetic control as a potential secondary and auxiliary test or something like that. And the idea is, with the difference in difference, you're sort of your key assumption is a parallel trends, right? So the whole game is about figuring out what is the counterfactual. We have these 88 companies that are sort of your quote unquote treated companies, that they've been treated with this information shock. And so then now you got to figure out, what is the right control group? What is the counterfactual group? And in the difference in difference setting, you need to basically look at the pre-period, and you want to see, in the pre-period that there isn't sort of a systematic difference in stock price performance, so that you can basically isolate the effect to, the information shock that happens on, call it the 14th of March or something like that. And so the way you do that in the difference in difference setting is what I do is I sort of include a bunch of controls to basically get at, so very transparently, the nice thing about this difference in difference method is you're very transparent about here are the set of controls that I think allow you to get at the counterfactual, right? And so in some ways it makes you it puts you in the position of a portfolio manager, because you're how do I think about stocks? I bucket stocks in the categories of size and leverage and profitability, industry, and those are all ingredients that go into the difference in difference control measures that sort of let you get to the parallel trends. The synthetic control method is actually a little bit more, the ways to get there is a little bit different. So you're actually not, you almost ensure parallel trends by basically looking at just the stock prices of all the companies, and you basically say, okay, what is the set of weights on the non-treated companies that basically mimic the behavior of the treated companies? And so you're actually not, you actually don't take this portfolio manager approach, and you're not really thinking transparently what are the right set of controls. You're actually being entirely, in some ways, data driven, but it's a little bit of a black box to figure out, I actually don't know why there is X% weight on this, control company. And so what you end up doing is you sort of have a very good fit in the pre-period. But then that sort of, now you got to think about how long is the pre-period that you want. So there's a fit question. So there's a fit benefit to the synthetic control method, but there's a transparency benefit to the difference in difference method. And you can sort of take your pick between the two of them.
Yeah. So it's not fundamentally something else is getting picked up in the political economy of campaign contributions. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, this is absolutely fascinating research. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I had great fun reading the papers, and lovely to see you again.
No, thank you so much, Shruti. This is such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also, check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.